Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is your first lecture um, in evolution of jazz. And for this, our topic for this little conversation here is really about how to listen to jazz music. This is not if you're not familiar with jazz, it's different enough that it's challenging for people to get into because in large part because they don't know how to listen to it. You need to know how to approach this music. You need to have an understanding of what they're doing, what the musicians are trying to accomplish, to enjoy it a little bit more. Otherwise, it's just background sound in a sense. So we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to talk about some of the early building blocks, particularly the blues and ragtime, which are not themselves jazz, but they were a big influence on what would become jazz. So these are sort of pre-jazz elements that, along with like American Popular Song and stuff like that, that played a big role. So let's get started, okay? When you listen to music, the music for this class, I would encourage you to listen more critically, listen deeper. I know if you're anything like me, when I get in my car, the radio's on or some music is coming out. But on that level of listening to it, you're really not deeply listening to the music. You're focusing on other things. You're kind of hearing it as sound, entertaining sort of sound, but you're not really kind of picking it apart and listening to the bits and pieces. I would encourage you for this class and other music, later on, to sort of remove other distractions, listen to this music in a more focused fashion. Turn the lights out or something sometimes. Get a really nice set of headphones. Close your eyes, whatever. Just remove other distractions, and you'll start to hear the music much more deeply. And some of these things will start to make sense a little bit more. So try that out. I encourage it. Okay. All right. For those of you who are not do not have like a lot of big musical background, I want to get into some basic elements here. So when we're talking about jazz and other sorts of music, but for our conversation, jazz, there are certain pieces of the puzzle. All right. There's melody. The melody is the tune that you can whistle or hum or sing. Right. I'm a pretty bad piano player, but I'm going to give you an example. So a melody is quite simply. Oops. See, I'm wrong. Right? That's a melody, right? Harmony, then, is the chord structure that supports the melody. So I can still have the tune, but now I can have a chord structure or the harmony supporting it. Right? All of this is very important in just about all sorts of music. Jazz in particular, harmony in particular, is very, very important. You also have rhythm. The rhythm is basically where notes fall in time. If you're tapping your toes to something, dee dee da 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 dee dee dee, every one of those notes is in a very specific place. That is the rhythm of the melody. Right? So that's really important. And jazz musicians in particular are going to play with the rhythm more than most people, for example. Okay? And then lastly, the form. Musical forms there's some really common ones like the 12-bar blues, like the 32-bar standard American song form, that kind of stuff that the jazz musicians use to express themselves. It helps if you kind of have an understanding of those forms. We're not going to go too in depth here, but I am going to, for example, introduce the 12-bar blues to you, and hopefully when you're listening to tunes that are based on the 12-bar blues, it'll help guide you in a sense, okay? So these are the pieces we're talking about, all right? Now in jazz, these elements are the same, but they are basically just a lot more complicated. They tend to be more complex and challenging, both for the performers and for the listeners. The music sort of evolved out of simple tunes, and then in sort of a game of one-upsmanship, got more and more and more complex, to see who could do it and who could kind of got left by the wayside, right? So melody functions the same; it's not substantially different. It's the tune. However, those melodies again can be very complex in certain types of jazz. When we talk about bebop, for example, the melodies are no longer necessarily hummable or singable. They're very fast and they're very challenging. And other sorts of jazz are very melodious and tuneful. There's a type of jazz called cool jazz that actually was a reaction in many ways against the complexity of bebop. And that's more sing-along-y stuff. A lot of music from the swing era you can hum along with and that kind of stuff. So there's a little bit of everything here. Harmony, same thing. Jazz harmony, the chords are usually much more complex, and they add a lot of other notes for color. For example, in a regular tune, you might get major chords, or maybe maybe like a major minor seventh chord. You don't need to worry about the specifics, but a seventh chord, right? That sounds pretty normal. Well, in jazz, this is the starting point, and then they start adding more and more complex harmonies to it, more notes to it. For example, instead of a regular B flat chord, right, I have this tune in front of me called "Blowing the Blues Away," and instead of starting on just a regular B flat major chord, it starts on a chord called the B flat 13 with a sharp 9. And you don't really need to know anything about that other than instead of sounding like this, it sounds like this. Right? And it's just more complex, more challenging for everybody involved, again, including the listeners. You might hear some things that you might actually, if you're not familiar with this music, you might think to yourself, is that right? Right? Are they making a mistake? No, they're just adding more notes to chords and making them more interesting, basically. Okay? As far as rhythm goes, most jazz has what we call a swing feel, and an abundance of syncopation. Now, there's a couple things I want to cover here. Before we get into that, I also want to mention the African traditions that a lot of jazz is based on also contains polyrhythms, and the concept of polyrhythm is very much an African, sub-Saharan African music. And polyrhythms are basically just multiple rhythms happening at the same time, and they don't necessarily go together, but it is the composite of all of these rhythms that make sort of one cohesive whole. That's what polyrhythm is. Okay, going back to the swing feel, if you would just, in the privacy of your own home, repeat after me. Say 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Good. So that is an even subdivision of the beat. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Every one of those, bop, 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 they're all the same length. That's an even subdivision. But in swing music, there's an uneven subdivision. Say doo-be, 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 doo. In that case, the do's are longer than the b's. So instead of 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, or 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, it's do-be, 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 do. That's a swing feel. And different jazz musicians have different degrees of swing. But jazz really hits its stride in the 19-teens, 1920s, when it becomes less rigid and stiff and relaxes more and swings more. And then you get the swing era in the 30s and all the fun dances affiliated with that kind of stuff and so on. And the swing feel sticks around, okay? The last term here is syncopation. Syncopation is basically emphasizing the spaces in between the beats. So if I were to clap on the beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, there's all this space in between the beats. Bop, 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 right? All that kind of stuff. That's syncopation, basically. You are emphasizing space in between the beats. Now, none of this will sound that exciting to you or perhaps unusual to you, and that's fine, because this has become part of the American musical language and it has been for 100 years. But 130 years ago, 120 years ago, when the most common musical language was sort of this pretty but kind of bland American popular song that didn't have a swing feel, didn't have a lot of syncopation, along comes this music that is highly syncopated and swings, and it was pretty revolutionary. It was radically different. Okay, and then in regards to the form here, jazz musicians take traditional forms like the 12-bar blues, like the 32-bar standard American song form, and they will adapt them for their needs or for their group's needs. So if it's a 12-bar blues, everybody knows the blues. Everybody can kind of solo and improvise and all this kind of stuff. The same thing with other forms. They understand the chord changes and all that kind of stuff. So these are things that is less common in pop music that you might be more familiar with, but is very common in the world of jazz. All right, great. So I talked about the swing feel, again, sort of maintaining a constant groove, right? Doobie doobie doo ba da boo dee ba doo boo doo ba da 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 doo da, stuff like that, right? Using, again, swing eighth notes, which is that uneven division of the beat. Okay, here's a really big thing. Jazz uses, more than just about any other type of music, jazz is focused on the art of improvisation. Improvising is spontaneously making stuff up, like in the moment. So if there's a saxophone solo that is being improvised, that person understands the form of the song. Are we playing a 12-bar blues? Are we playing something else? They understand the harmonies. They understand the chords that they are playing over. They know what notes will work with their chord, with those chords, what notes won't work with those chords, right? And then they use that information to, in the moment, create new music. And so it's new every single night. It's constantly evolving. It's constantly changing. If a soloist is angry because he broke up with his lady, right, he might improvise completely differently than 2 nights later after they kissed and made up, and now everything's peas and carrots again, and now he's going to improvise differently at that point. It's always evolving, always changing, always sort of innovating, right? That's what jazz is. And this is a really big part of it, okay? In early jazz, there's more of a collective improvisation, multiple instruments spontaneously creating music in a sense, in like a dialogue with each other. One instrument might do one thing and the other one listens to it and then sort of reacts to it, right? And you have this constant discussion amongst instruments and things like that. Again, all of them creating it sort of new. Okay. Later on, starting in the 1920s, we steer towards this direction of solo improvisation, which is just individuals getting everybody out of the way for the most part, for them to improvise and say something important, right? To make a statement, to tell a story, to express themselves, and not have to worry about necessarily making room for that many other people, right? Dedicated space for individuals to express themselves. You're going to hear a lot of that in a lot of the examples I provide for you, because improvisation is such a key part of jazz music. Okay. All right. So a couple of things to consider. In the pre-jazz era, which I'm at least this point, we're kind of starting after the Civil War and going right up until, the early 1900s. Jazz basically starts around the turn of the century in New Orleans, give or take. It wasn't a thing that was created like, hey, I invented this on this day. That's not how it works. Okay, so you have to understand that jazz was an African-American creation, and it was Black musicians from the South incorporating all of these different musical elements and creating something new. It's like a recipe. There's a little bit of salt, there's a little bit of sugar, there's a little bit of, flour, there's a whatever, and you all mix it together and you get this new thing. Well, all those ingredients are other different types of music and, other sorts of things that they're living. For example, the Civil Rights Act, the very first one, was passed right after the Civil War in 1866. Now we have freed slaves. Blacks are a free people. It's no coincidence that the Ku Klux Klan started the very same year, right? 30 years later, in a Supreme Court case that is very well known, and you'll see a little video clip about it, the Supreme Court, in an 8-1 decision, said that separate but equal facilities were constitutional. That was the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And that would rule the land from 1896 until the early 1960s. The Plessy versus Ferguson was overturned in the late 50s, and then it took a little bit of time for everything to kind of come out in the wash. And the last real civil rights legislation was passed. The big ones were passed in the early 1960s. Okay. After the Civil War, a lot of freed African Americans, they were not educated. They didn't know anything other than, agriculture, being slaves. So they stayed on large farms, but they were no longer slaves. They became what's known as sharecroppers, which is basically indentured servitude by another name. They were still poor. They did not have any way to really be upwardly mobile. They couldn't get out from the oppressive landowners, that sort of stuff. So this sort of dire poverty led many African Americans from the South to eventually leave the South in what is known as the Great Migration. It is a move of blacks from the former Confederacy states across the country, particularly to large urban areas like New York, Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, Kansas City, Philadelphia, towns like that. To be clear, it wasn't just African Americans that took part in the Great Migration. A lot of rural white Southerners also didn't have a lot going for them, so they also would move out of the South looking for better economic opportunities in large towns. But at the early 20th century, Detroit had the Ford Motor Company, and they were starting to build cars on the assembly line. You could get a good job, go from a Mississippi sharecropper to a Detroit auto worker, right? And essentially move up socially, have a better chance, have a more comfortable life, raise your family, and that sort of stuff. Come to Milwaukee, get a job in the Schlitz Brewery, and again, sort of a middle class lifestyle and that kind of stuff. That's what these people were doing. And eventually, as they flocked out of the South, they brought with them their music and their musical traditions and their appreciation for this music. So as the people left, musicians would follow, and because all these transplants from the South are going to want music that they heard in Mississippi or New Orleans or Alabama or whatever, Georgia. And so the musicians go, and they now set up shop in the South Side of Chicago, in New York City, in all of these other places, and they continue to innovate the music in those places as well. Okay. Before jazz, out of the African American side of things, you get things like work songs, you get various forms of dance music, you get religious hymns and things like that. That is sort of common contributions to jazz from the African American community in particular. You also get large groups of European immigrants coming in the late 19th century. They're also looking for work. They're oftentimes crowding these very large towns because these big towns is where some of the work is, right? So you get all kinds of people. You get Italians, Germans, Irish, Eastern European Jews, Spanish, people from the Caribbean, all this sort of stuff. All of these people are bringing with them their music. So if you're a musician and you're a working musician in New Orleans was the biggest city in the southern United States, and you're going to have lots of African Americans. And so you might be playing the blues or ragtime or that kind of stuff. But you might have a large contingency of Italians, and they like Italian opera. So you might need to know and have a concept of opera, understand opera, know how to maybe play something that sounds like opera. You might have a bunch of Germans, and they like the polka. You may need to know how to play a polka. So if you get a gig, you can play polkas and they can dance and everybody has a good time, right? So musicians sort of have to accumulate all of this different information and be ready to do a bunch of different things. Eventually, those in a polka band and they played in a blues band last night and they're playing in a polka band today, those things start to kind of mix and match and change ideas. So they might play a bluesy lick in a polka tune, and someone might hear it and go, oh, that's cool. And then they do something back and forth and they start to improvise or start to tweak things a little bit, right? That's basically how jazz starts. It's very organic, and it takes American popular song. It takes elements of European music and folk musics and things like that. It takes the blues. It takes ragtime. It takes these work songs and whatever, and it all gets in the hot, steamy New Orleans sun, and this new stuff is sort of reborn out of it, and that is jazz. Okay? Like I said, this rich mixture of immigrants brought new styles, new instruments, different types of ensembles. It led to new hybrid forms incorporating all of these elements: African elements, European elements, Latin American elements. Okay? Music was everywhere, particularly in New Orleans. Minstrelsy, the theatrical productions of white people putting black on their face and mimicking African American culture, songs, dances, language, all for humor. That was the most popular form of entertainment at that time. A lot of pop songs were coming out of minstrel shows. These musicians would have to know these tunes so they could play them in the saloon, in the club, in the whatever later on that night. So all of these things mixed together, and this is what takes place. Ragtime here as well. The rhythmic excitement of ragtime. All this stuff again mixes together, and eventually you're going to get something that comes out the other end, and that's called jazz. Okay. All right. So one of the main things we're going to focus on, as far as formally, of these early types of influences on jazz is the blues. Now, again, the blues and jazz are different. Jazz uses the blues, but they're not the same in a sense. The blues form is used and adopted by jazz musicians all the time. The style of playing the blues, certain bluesy notes like the blues scale and stuff like that, the blues tonality, all very prominent in jazz. Okay, so it's an early jazz influence developing out of Negro spirituals, slave haulers, church music of the Southern Baptist Church, that kind of stuff. This is what I want you to understand about the blues structure. And I'm actually going to share with you a video that I made showing you the 12-bar blues, right? It's just going to show you how it works. And I'm also going to upload some tunes for you to listen to that show you the 12-bar blues as well. And hopefully it'll make sense. Okay, so the most common form of the blues is 12 measures, the 12-bar blues, 4 beats per measure. It's divided into 3 4-bar phrases. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? The first one makes some sort of statement about why you have the blues. The second one typically repeats that exact statement, maybe embellishes it a little bit with an ooh or a baby or whatever, but it's the same statement. And the last 4 measures answers that statement somehow. They provide some sort of solution to the problem, or they just kind of reinforce, well, that's how it is, and whatever, that kind of stuff. The harmony is very simple. It only uses 3 chords. So you're going to get really just 3 different chords. Better than that and more complex than that, but generally that's it. The 1, 4, 5 chord in any key. Not terribly important, but I just want you to understand it has 3 chords. So when you see the video, you can kind of follow along a little bit. And really this form is just a simple structure that can be manipulated for whoever is using it. Okay. So I'm going to do a couple of things here. First, I'm going to tell you the difference of different types of blues. And both of these sort of would be influential on jazz and sort of share a certain language with jazz, early jazz. Okay. The first type, the earliest type of blues is known as country blues or rural blues. And this is your stereotypical male itinerant sort of hobo guy with his guitar singing the blues by himself, right? Themes of hardship accompanying themselves on the guitar does not always adhere perfectly to the 12-bar structure. It doesn't have to, because it's just a guy and a guitar, right? If he's not done singing about why his lady left him, it might be 16.5 bars. It really doesn't matter. It's just his language and him playing the blues. This was the earliest form of the blues. A more sophisticated form of the blues that developed a little bit later is known as urban blues or classic blues. This would typically be female performers instead of males. Instead of a guy with a guitar, it is a female with a group of musicians. You're going to hear a group of people playing together. So a female with a band, basically. The subject matter is usually a little bit more sophisticated, love songs and whatnot. And because it is a group of people, they have to adhere to the 12-bar structure very closely. Everybody has to know exactly when the chords change. So you have to do this exactly the way you're supposed to do this, okay? Those are things to keep in mind. I'm going to upload for you onto Moodle 3 tunes, 1 classic blues, 1 country blues, and 1 example of how instrumental jazz musicians would then take the blues form and play it and apply it, right? So the classic blues I'm giving you is Backwater Blues by Bessie Smith. It's that A line of text, oh, I'm so sad, and this is why. Another A line of text, oh, I'm so sad, this is why. And then a different line of text known as B. So B, this is why I'm so sad, or something like that, right? That's Backwater Blues. Then the country blues is just Robert Johnson with his guitar. And then I'm going to give you Hellhound on My Trail. And then again, Jelly Roll Morton was playing with a small band, and they were playing Dead Man Blues. And this is, again, the same form, but this is how an early jazz group would apply that form, just not necessarily with vocals, more instrumentalists and improvisation and that kind of stuff. So I want you to take a minute right now, pause this video, and then go listen or go watch my little video on the blues that I've uploaded to Moodle for you, or I've provided a link for you on Moodle, and then listen to these 3 blues songs, and then come back and we're going to start talking about ragtime. So pause this and go check them out, and then come back. Go. Okay, are you back? Great. We're going to do the same thing with another early sort of influence on jazz, and that's ragtime. Ragtime piano, there's a couple of different piano styles we're going to talk about here, and I'm going to kind of tell you the difference between them, even though they might sound the same to a lot of you, and that's totally fine too. The first is ragtime. This was the earliest sort of solo piano style. What you should know about ragtime, it is completely composed. It's not jazz. There's no improvisation. But what is really influential that came out of ragtime is the drastic amount of syncopation in this music. Okay, formally, ragtime uses a form that is common in military marches, where there are strains of music, and those strains are repeated. So the A strain is followed immediately by the A strain again. So if you miss something the first time, you're going to get it again, and then the B strain repeated, the C strain repeated, and so on. Okay, several strains, usually repeated twice. It contains a loose, highly syncopated rhythm, also known as ragged, which is where ragtime comes from. You're ragging the time. Okay, and what I want you to see, I want you to hear, but I also want you to see, because I'm going to upload a video for you to watch a guy playing the piano, is these piano players basically do 2 different things. The right hand on a piano plays the high notes, right? And so the high notes in ragtime is going to be this highly syncopated melody, right? I'm a terrible piano player, but highly syncopated melody. Meanwhile, the left hand is playing low notes, right? And they tend to do this thing where they would play like, they're basically mimicking a bass drum and a crash cymbal, like boom chick, boom chick, boom chick, boom chick, and you get this. Right, that kind of thing. So boom chick, boom chick, boom chick. But I'm doing it with 2 hands. They would actually do that with 1 hand. Boom chick, boom chick, boom chick, while the right hand plays this highly syncopated melody. So you get this very steady beat in the left hand, 1, 2, 3, 4, boom chick, boom chick, boom chick, and the other hand is doing this highly syncopated melody. I'm going to upload a guy playing the Maple Leaf Rag, and I use this video in class so you can see his hands. during the B strain in particular, it's very clear what he's doing, hopefully. And chances are you've heard that tune before as well. Some well-known ragtime composers, or at least the very first and arguably most well-known ragtime composer, was a guy named Scott Joplin. Scott Joplin was a African-American piano player from Missouri, Mississippi Delta region, southern Missouri. And he played in social clubs, and he just, was one of the guys that started ragging up popular tunes and fiddling with the rhythms and making them more interesting. And it sort of caught on, and then they wrote new music to do the same thing, right? And it became very popular. They printed millions of copies of sheet music of this sort of music, and it spread like crazy, right? Scott Joplin was the most prolific of these composers. He composed the Maple Leaf Rag, which I will share a video of for you, The Entertainer, which is a well-known tune, and many others, okay? Then you get a guy like Jelly Roll Morton, who you're going to see a video on Jelly Roll Morton. Jelly Roll Morton was a jazz piano player, an early jazz piano player, but he kind of came out of a ragtime tradition. But whereas I mentioned here, ragtime is completely composed, Jelly Roll Morton would start to improvise around ragtime. So he'd play in a ragtime style, and he'd play ragtime tunes, but he would take it a bit further by starting to improvise around the melodies and that kind of stuff. Other really important factoids about Jelly Roll Morton: he was the very first to have actually written down music to be played in a jazz style. So he showed that jazz could be orchestrated. I could write this out, and everyone's going to play what I want. And before that, it was very much an oral music. They didn't read off of sheet music; they just played. He claimed to have invented jazz. He was alive in the 1940s when people were documenting the birth of this music. And so some folks from the Library of Congress interviewed him, because a lot of other people had passed away. So they interviewed Jelly Roll Morton, and he had a bit of an ego and said, yeah, I'm the best, and I invented this thing, and blah, 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 which of course is not true, but must have been good while it lasted, right? And he also took the very stiffness of ragtime, and he smoothed it out, and it starts to swing a little bit more. It's more relaxed. Again, I'm going to give you a couple of different examples of things to listen to. I'm going to give you a Scott Joplin tune, and I'll give you a Jelly Roll Morton version of the same tune, and you'll kind of hear what he does to it to kind of move it along the evolutionary chain here, okay? So ragtime is a big influence on jazz, all right? There are other piano styles that are also very influential, and you will see little clips about these in the coming days. I don't want to give you too much right away. One of those is stride piano. Now, ragtime started in the Mississippi Delta region, Missouri, that kind of stuff, along the Mississippi River. Stride started in Harlem. There was a large African-American community in Harlem at the turn of the century, and they would have these parties known as rent parties, and oftentimes people would have what they called cutting contests, where piano players would kind of go back to back and try to outdo each other. They didn't literally cut each other. Cutting was figuratively, I cut you, meaning I bested you, that sort of stuff. This is a highly virtuosic style. It's very similar to ragtime. It has that boom chick, boom chick, boom chick in the left hand, very steady pulse here, and a highly syncopated right hand, except whereas ragtime is totally composed, stride piano, they're improvising. So they're very steady in the left hand, but they're improvising like mad in the right hand. Highly syncopated, spontaneous improvisation, right? So again, ragtime is composed, where stride relies mainly on improvisation. Ragtime uses that strict form of repeated strains, A, B, B, C, C, and so on. Stride can be any number of forms. It could be the 12-bar blues. It could be the American popular song form. It could change things up quite a bit, okay? And generally, it's faster and just more aggressive and more virtuosic. All of this music is complicated. If you grew up playing the piano, maybe you played some ragtime music. This is hard stuff, okay? You'll see a little clip to explain more on this as well, but I'll also upload some examples for you to listen to now, okay? Guys like James P. Johnson was known as the father of stride piano, and Fats Waller was a composer and a contemporary of of the blues singer Bessie Smith and Louis Armstrong in particular, guys like that. He played some mean stride himself, right? I'll give you a few examples. The last piano style that we're going to talk about here is boogie woogie. Boogie woogie, instead of doing this boom chick, boom chick, boom chick thing in the bass, it actually uses a shuffle. It'll do this. Or it will have like a walking bass line, like a bass going boom, 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 boom. Right, that, again, forgive my piano playing, but more of a walking bass line, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, like that. And while they're doing that, again, improvising melodies with the right hand, okay? Boogie woogie will actually be a really big influence on rock and roll. It kind of develops in the 20s. It becomes very important in rhythm and blues music, and then that itself becomes very important in early rock and roll, particularly guys like Little Richard, Tutti Frutti, Oh Rudy, that kind of stuff, Long Tall Sally, Jerry Lee Lewis, Goodness Gracious, Great Balls of Fire, those sorts of things. That's all sort of a boogie woogie piano thing. And that started earlier in its own form, was very influential in jazz, and of course then other styles later on. I will upload one tune by Maud Lou Lewis just to kind of, again, give you an example of this boogie woogie style, right? Let me be very clear. All the stuff we just covered, the blues, and these 3 different piano styles, ragtime, stride, and boogie woogie, they're not jazz. They are their own things. But this stuff would be very influential, boogie woogie and ragtime in particular, very influential on the development of jazz. You could argue that stride and boogie woogie are leaning more towards jazz, particularly because of their improvisation, those elements. But they are not in and of themselves jazz, but they are major building blocks to what will be jazz. Okay, so do me a favor. Again, if you haven't already, go watch that blues, the 12-bar blues video, and listen to all the things I uploaded on Moodle for you, the different styles of blues, and now the different styles of piano playing, just to kind of get you acclimated to what's going to come next, and you may hear some of these influences in some of the music that I share with you on the next video. Okay, so this is your first one. Nice job. Go check out everything else I assigned to you, and we will see you guys next time. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.